My name is Ken Baumann. I run the channel cEDH. We make videos about Commander, both casual and competitive. I also run the Krark Discord, which is called the Thumbless, and maintain primers for 3 competitive Krark lists: Krark Sakashima, Krark Thrasios, and Krark Timna. Outside the world of Magic, I'm a writer. You can find info about my books at kenbaumann.com. And I also publish cEDH.guide, which is an introductory resource for folks curious about playing competitively. So Krark Sakashima is a manual storm deck that relies on Krark's triggered ability to copy and put back in your hand instants or sorceries, and it typically wins with a storm payoff like Grape Shot or Lightning Bolt, or decking your opponents with Brain Freeze. So the deck's primary game plan is to resolve its commander, Krark the Thumbless, as soon as possible. Oftentimes you follow that up with resolving Sakashima and have that enter as a Krark. And by adding additional Krark triggers, you increase the probability of both copying an instant or sorcery and putting it back in your hand. And we can use instants and sorceries like Twin Flame to make copies of our creatures, direct damage spells like Lightning Bolt, storm spells to create big resource imbalances with our Magecraft creatures. Basically, repeating any spell that provides some kind of advantage over and over and over again usually wins you to a game-winning state, either with a ton of permanents on board or with a bunch of damage that you can deal on the stack or milling out opponents with Brain Freeze. But that's the primary game plan. Rely on Krark's triggered ability, supplement it, and then use instants and sorceries to close out the game. And then backup plan is Breach and Brain Freeze and LED if you so choose. But most wins are from the Krark stuff. The deck tends to win between turns 4 and 5. It can support earlier win attempts on turns 2 and 3, but 4 and 5 is the sweet spot. A usual turn 3 looks like an attempt at developing a huge resource disparity between you and your opponents, and that usually looks like trying to resolve a spell like Jeska's Will and copying it with Krark's triggered ability, or Frantic Search, or a cantrip like Impulse and putting a bunch of cards in your hand. Usually the first few turns require you to set up an engine using Krark, and then like a supplement like Tavern Scoundrel, which generates treasures when you win flips, or Stormkiln Artist, or Burgi, something that provides you an additional advantage when you are spinning your wheels casting instants or sorceries. And then usually, if all goes according to plan, by turn 4 or 5, you have kind of an overwhelming amount of advantage and are able to storm off. So this deck is a manual storm deck, and what that means is that there aren't very many easy infinite combos. So you have to generate large sums of mana and drawing cards and etc., which requires you to keep close attention to your storm count, the amount of floating mana you have. And if you want to be a good, tight Magic player, you need to declare all of those things when you are moving through your storm turn. So knowing how to visualize and visually represent the stack as well is a very important part of piloting this deck comfortably, because it creates crazy big stacks. And so both for your own sanity and for the sanity of your opponents, you really should have a way to visually represent that, so that you can represent Krark triggers, copies created by Krark, Magecraft triggers, storm triggers, whatever. So I think that with some visual tools that can help out with stack management and with a good pen and paper to keep track of storm and floating mana, you're fine. And it takes a little bit of practice to get used to doing that quickly, but that bookkeeping element is definitely a part of this deck, like it is with so many storm decks. So this is, in my mind, this is an easy mulligan. We want a nice stable mana base to start. This deck really rewards sometimes keeping 7s or 6s that feel well-rounded, that have a little bit of everything. And so the fact that you're off red mana here is just, don't even think about it. Just ship that and find a better hand. Okay, so this hand gives you a turn 1 Krark, which is often the biggest priority, particularly if you're in a pod in which you suspect Drannith Magistrate. So if you can get underneath Drannith Magistrate by resolving Krark first, that will get you in a nice position where you can leverage your resources and break parity on stacks. So Mox Diamond and Volk Island pitching a mountain Krark is great. You also have a turn 2 Rhystic Study, which is fantastic. I think Rhystic Study is, at least according to my little spreadsheet, best card in the deck. So having card draw multiple sources of card draw between Brainstorm and Rhystic Study is great. Void Snare is a pretty potent piece of interaction. It's not instant speed, but again, this deck tries to win on its turn most often, and so it's a really nice piece that you can use to bounce any stax piece that's slowing you down or something that's threatening on board. So I think that this hand is not the most explosive, but it's very, very stable. And I think that is probably worth it as a second 7. Mold of 5. So you've got 3 lands, both colors, that turn on Monk Salvage and Submerge. That's nice. Springleaf Drum sets up a nice turn 2, because then you have a mana up with which you can bluff interaction, which is kind of good. Shredder is a nice grind engine, and you see both Shredder and Frantic Search and Breach. So I think I would be tempted to keep 2 lands, Springleaf Drum, and probably Shredder and Search, and maybe bottom Breach. Frantic and Ledger Shredder feed Breach quite well, but Breach is really a backup plan and generally is just used as recursion in the deck. So I think that keeping 2 lands, Springleaf Drum, Shredder, and Frantic Search would be wise. And, if you miss your 3rd land drop, that's okay. You still are on 3 mana and can cast Shredder and hopefully find, a stable next couple turns. So I think that this hand is keepable, and particularly at 5, I would not be upset with this hand at all. I would just emphasize again that turn 1 Krark is usually what you're looking for. If you're not finding a turn 1 Krark, then you usually want to try to find a turn 1 Mystic Remora or an early Rhystic Study. Otherwise, there are plenty of considerations based on pod composition, but a good rule of thumb, pun intended, is shoot for the early Krark and early Sakashima. If you can get turn 1 Krark, turn 2 Sakashima, that is an excellent curve and will really put you way ahead unless opponents are very, very wary and disciplined. So I think that this deck struggles the most against explosive stacks. I'm not saying stacks generally, because stacks decks that slowly turn over turn layer their effects. Krark Sakashima, by copying and putting back in your hand an instant or sorcery, can usually break parity on rule of law effects by just playing control for a couple turns and then trying to bounce the stacks and go off. But decks like Winota, or we'll just say Winota, is the deck's toughest matchup. Winota is one of the best decks out there, and it certainly, in my mind, is the strongest stacks deck because it solves Stax' problem, which is it needs to layer multiple pieces quickly in order to lock down the game. And Winota does that right out of the command zone. So Winota is a tough matchup. I would recommend that Krark pilots, again, shoot for that early Krark, try to race Winota if possible, and if you can't, try to be very wary about Winota moving to combat and getting those triggers. Bounce Winota at the beginning of combat step so that Winota is locked out of being recast until post-combat main phase. And so yeah, you're either going to race or you need to bide your time, be patient, and bounce stuff at the right time and then try to go off. This deck, I think, plays incredibly well against midrange. Really 4+ color decks like Timna Thrasios or Kinrith or whatever. I think this deck thrives really well because it does what midrange wants to do, namely play effective interaction, and a lot of it. It does that better than midrange because Krark lets you recycle your interaction and use it multiple times. So that puts it a step ahead, I think, and then it also can win about as early as most mid-range decks in a more explosive fashion than mid-range. Mid-range can win early with compact combos, but mid-range decks typically aren't as explosive in the early game. So I find that that's the best matchup for the deck, and I'd say that against turbo decks like Turbo Nas decks or Peer decks or Breach or whatever, decks that really, really, really want to win as soon as possible, that this deck is a fine matchup. It's really a stable matchup if you mulligan well. If you mulligan to early interaction and then try to develop and go off right after the turbo player. So many cEDH games are determined by who goes for it second, and that holds very true with this deck as well. So usually if you're playing against turbo, you can mulligan appropriately and kind of manage that matchup well. But if you're playing against Winota, Godspeed. You're going to need all your skill and all your luck on your side because that deck is so explosive as well. Flipping coins is a lot of fun, so I understand the desire to just jump straight into the list, and I support it. I would say anything complicated, because I think, in my mind at least, any cEDH deck is complicated because Magic is an incredibly hard game with many complex pieces. And so like any deck, I would recommend, hey, do a little reading, watch some gameplay videos, talk to pilots, ask questions, just try to familiarize yourself with it before jamming it at your LGS or with your friends. But again, I would recommend that to anybody for any deck for the most, other than like maybe precons. I'd say like, yeah, see if you can find it online and watch somebody play it and get a sense of whether or not you'll like those play patterns. Because it'll save you time and money and effort and all that. Even if you're proxying, you got to print stuff out. So just, try to get a sense of what the deck gets up to. And then when you are piloting it, if you like it, I would say just do your best to try to be efficient, because it's storm decks and they can eat up a lot of time at the table and have historically in all formats in Magic's history. And also, your opponents are part of that too. So encourage them, really help them understand how the deck works, and encourage them to pass priority efficiently and quickly when you put stuff on the stack. Because in my experience, that's why Krark decks sometimes take a while, because opponents like to hem and haw and try to figure out when to interact, and that can take a lot of time.